I didn't expect that ordinary Tuesday afternoon to turn into the moment that would redefine everything I believed in. The room still smelled of the coffee I had made earlier, while the sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating the painting we had bought together on a trip to Tuscany. But that man was there, standing with his arm around my wife, as if he belonged there. She hugged him without the slightest embarrassment, and when I questioned her with a trembling voice, she just smiled. "You are too jealous," she said, with a tone of contempt that burned more than any word of accusation. Every bit of confidence I had crumbled as she clung to him, in front of me, as if I were invisible. "Do you have an affair with him?" My voice finally came out, louder than I intended. She rolled her eyes, as if she were a teenager confronted by an angry parent. And I knew, at that moment, that it wasn't the first time. The look between the two was a silent code that needed no translation. I felt anger rise, burning in my throat, but with it came something deeper, a pain that seemed to burn holes inside me. It was as if the ground had become a swamp, and I was sinking, with nothing to hold on to. The weight of her betrayal crushed my thoughts as my voice finally broke the silence. "I want to divorce you now." It was at that moment that she finally lost her smile. Something flashed in his eyes, maybe it was fear, maybe it was anger at my audacity to face what was happening. And he, the lover, the intruder, just stood there, motionless, a helpless spectator or silent accomplice. That moment seemed to stretch on, every second filled with a tension I never knew could exist between two people who once loved each other. In the days that followed, the pieces began to fall into place. There were signs I ignored for years. The quickly closed text messages, the excuses for frequent absences, the long showers while the cell phone was strategically placed away from my hands. She said I was obsessed, that the problem was my paranoia, but now I realize it was all a game of mirrors. How many times did she call me crazy, while hiding secrets under the same roof where we said our vows? And he, this man who seemed like a stranger, was actually much more familiar than I cared to admit. I discovered that he wasn't just an outsider, he had been introduced into our lives in a calculated way. A family friend, she said. A job counselor, she insisted. But the casual dinners, the innocent group encounters, it was all a cover. "You are pathetic," she shouted one day, during an argument that blew up like an unexpected storm. "If only you had paid attention, you wouldn't have lost everything. I deserve more, something you were never able to give." His words cut me like blades, but at the same time, each blow made me more determined. She thought she had won. She thought it was entirely my fault. From that moment on, I knew exposure was inevitable. It wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about how she manipulated everything, even our daughter, to justify her actions. "Daddy, you should be more understanding with Mommy," she said once, repeating words that clearly weren't hers. The poison my wife poured into our family was now entrenched, corrupting everything that was once pure. I knew the only way to fight this was to let the truth speak louder. The next few months were a silent battle, planning for the exact moment when every illusion she had created would collapse like a house of cards. The lies she wove, the secrets she hid, I unearthed them one by one, like an archaeologist unearthing the remains of a lost civilization. I waited for the right moment. And when it arrived, there was no mercy. During an event where she strutted like the perfect wife, next to that man who dared to smile at me as if nothing had happened, I finally took the stage. I knew there were people who loved watching dramas, but no one was prepared for the spectacle I was about to put on. "I want to thank everyone for being here," I began, my voice calm but charged with a purpose that made everyone in the room stop and listen. Their expressions changed as the words started to come out. The truth was like a sharp blade cutting through the air. This woman, who I called my wife, and this man, who many of you know as our friend, have a relationship that goes beyond what anyone here could imagine. The silence that followed was so deafening that it seemed to weigh heavily on the chests of everyone there. Their faces were a mix of shock and horror. She tried to interrupt, stammering out excuses and lies, but there was no going back. I had proof. Messages. Photographs. Everything she needed to make it clear that she wasn't the victim she always pretended to be. You think you know people. But where does trust go when it's trampled on by those who are supposed to protect it? My question hung in the air, with no answer, just the sound of heavy breathing from someone who had just had their illusions destroyed. At that moment, I didn't know what would come next. But she knew her game was up. The humiliation was just the beginning. They thought they could destroy me. But what they didn't know was that sometimes something indestructible is reborn from fire. What happened after that night? This is something that neither they nor I were ready to face. Welcome to our channel. Here, we repudiate any form of betrayal and believe that it never brings happiness. All stories presented are fictional, but aim to show how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and families. Get ready for an intense story, full of twists and emotions, that will keep you hooked from beginning to end. Hold on tight, because this story is going to be shocking. Happy listening. The house where Ethan and Clara lived was a reflection of what they believed to be a solid marriage, built over 15 years of shared life. Every detail seemed carefully chosen to tell their story. Photographs of their trips together since the beginning of their relationship were displayed in elegant frames along the walls. There was a welcoming atmosphere in the air, a sense of permanence that made any visitor believe that nothing could shake that home. But what was happening in the depths of the human heart often escaped superficial glances. Ethan was a dedicated man, marked by his disciplined and gentle demeanor. He worked as an architect and often spent hours in his home office, reviewing plans and designing dreams for his clients. He was meticulous and calm, someone who preferred stability to impulsiveness. For him, life was about building something that would last, both professionally and personally. Clara, on the other hand, was the opposite in many ways. His vibrant energy seemed to light up any room. As an events consultant, she was always surrounded by people, managing meetings, parties and dinners. The intensity with which he lived his life often contrasted with Ethan's more reserved manner. Even though they had different personalities, it seemed like it balanced them out. Clara often joked that Ethan was her anchor, keeping her steady when things got chaotic, while he said she was his inspiration, bringing color to what he often saw in black and white. This dynamism was something they shared with pride among friends, creating the image of an almost perfect couple. However, behind closed doors, not everything was as harmonious as it seemed. In recent years, Clara felt that something was missing. She didn't know exactly what it was, but there was a growing uneasiness inside her. Maybe it was the weight of responsibilities or the monotony that had settled into his routine. She tried to fill this void with new projects, new hobbies, but she always ended up returning to the same feeling. Ethan, on the other hand, was oblivious to this inner turmoil. He believed that the love between them was enough to sustain any difficulty. He worked tirelessly to ensure Clara's comfort, often sacrificing his free time to meet extra work demands, in the hope that this would mean more security for their future. It was difficult to tell exactly when things started to change. Maybe it was an accumulation of small moments. The absence of meaningful conversations during dinner. The way Clara always seemed to have her cell phone in her hand, typing messages or smiling at the screen, while Ethan remained silent. Or maybe it was when Ethan started to feel like her smiles were more reserved for other people than for him. He wondered if it was just a phase, something normal after so many years together. But Clara, in turn, began to convince herself that the spark between them had gone out. It wasn't that she didn't love Ethan, but the love felt more like a memory than an actual presence. Despite this, they continued to try to keep up appearances. Dinners with friends still took place, filled with laughter and stories that Clara told masterfully, always being the center of attention. Ethan watched from afar, often with a mixture of pride and uneasiness, not knowing exactly why it bothered him. He had everything planned, even a surprise trip for their upcoming wedding anniversary. It was his way of trying to rekindle something he feared had been lost. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to be increasingly distant from these gestures. There was also the figure of a third person who began to appear almost imperceptibly. Liam, Clara's colleague on some projects, was someone who had a strong presence and a relaxed manner. He and Clara often exchanged laughs during meetings and quick after-hours messages. Ethan knew him vaguely, but he saw no reason to worry. For him, Clara was loyal and always would be. There was no room for doubts, although they began to hover, silently. The weeks passed, and the distance between Ethan and Clara increased almost imperceptibly, but constantly. Conversations became shorter, almost always about practical topics. Ethan, in his lonely moments, began revisiting the photo albums they had stored in a drawer. There they were, smiling on distant beaches, hugging each other at family parties, sharing moments that seemed so full of life. He wondered where exactly they had gotten lost. Clara, on the other hand, avoided looking at these photos. Each image seemed to remind her of something she could no longer feel, something she had perhaps been searching for elsewhere, without realizing it. There was also a growing silence between them, a silence that said more than any argument could. Ethan tried to break it down occasionally by suggesting something they could do together, but Clara always had an excuse. She was busy, tired, or simply needed time to herself. To Ethan, these responses were like little barbs, piling up until they became too painful to ignore. Clara found herself trapped in a dilemma. She knew Ethan was a good man, someone who loved her deeply. But what do you do when love seems to no longer be enough? Liam, with his constant attention and praise, seemed to offer something she couldn't define, but that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't something she planned or sought out, but the connection between them was undeniable, yet maintained at a level she told herself was harmless. The stage was set. The house that was once a refuge for love now seemed like a stage where the whispers of dissatisfaction echoed. Ethan, lost in his efforts to rescue what he believed to be unbreakable, and Clara, fighting against an emptiness that even she didn't fully understand. The balance that held their marriage together was about to be tested in ways neither of them could predict, and the truth that lay ahead promised to change everything. What was really happening between them was still a mystery, even for those who lived through it. But the silence and unspoken emotions that hung in the air were already beginning to plant the seeds of what would be an inevitable revelation. The weeks that followed were marked by growing tension inside that house that no longer felt like a home. Ethan felt the weight of the emotional distance between him and Clara increasing every day. His affectionate gestures, which had previously felt natural and flowed effortlessly, now seemed calculated, almost as if he was desperately trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through his fingers. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to float in another reality, where her body was present, but her mind was in a distant, unreachable place. Their routine followed almost like a rehearsed play, where each movement was done automatically. Ethan tried to start topics, create moments of connection, but Clara responded vaguely, always with the excuse of being busy or tired. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. He began to notice the details, the smiles she gave when looking at her cell phone, the frequent departures for meetings that never seemed to end at the right time, the smell of a different perfume that she sometimes brought with her. One night, while Clara was taking a shower, Ethan saw her cell phone on the table. He hesitated for a few moments, the morality of the act fighting against the need to understand what was happening. His heart pounded as he picked up the device and unlocked the screen. The messages were there, clearly exchanged with Liam. There was an intimacy in those words that made Ethan's stomach turn. He couldn't continue reading. He put his cell phone back and went to the window, trying to process what he had just discovered. In the following days, Ethan began to observe Clara with different eyes. He saw her leave the house earlier than usual. He saw the sparkle in her eyes when she responded to messages on her cell phone, he saw the lame excuses she gave when he suggested going out together. Every detail seemed to confirm what he already knew but didn't want to accept. Still, he remained silent, perhaps because part of him hoped this was a phase, something she would put behind her. Maybe because, deep down, he still wanted to believe in the woman he had married. Meanwhile, Clara was experiencing a roller coaster of emotions. Liam had become more than a colleague or a friend. He was an escape, a distraction from the emptiness she had felt for so long. In the furtive meetings they had, Clara felt an adrenaline rush that she hadn't experienced in years. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she justified it to herself that she deserved to be happy, that Ethan was no longer the man she needed by her side. These justifications, however, did not erase the guilt that sometimes arose in moments of silence, when she was alone with her thoughts. The relationship between her and Liam evolved quickly and intensely. He was charismatic, he knew exactly what to say to make her feel special. Clara let herself get involved, perhaps because she was tired of fighting against what seemed inevitable. The meetings took place in discreet places, away from the eyes of acquaintances, but the constant risk only made everything more exciting for her. Clara had convinced herself that she was in control, that she could maintain this double life without major consequences. Ethan, in turn, began planning his next steps. He knew he needed concrete proof before confronting her. He decided that he would follow Clara on one of her night outs. That Friday, while she was getting ready for another supposed meeting, Ethan pretended to be busy in his office, but he could barely contain his anxiety. When she left, he waited a few minutes before grabbing his keys and following her. The night was cold, and the wind bit his face as he drove a safe distance from Clara's car. She parked at a restaurant Ethan knew well, a place they used to go together on special occasions. He stayed in the car, watching as she got in and was greeted by Liam. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. The sight of the two of them, so comfortable in each other's company, was like a punch in the gut. He remained in the car for a few minutes, fighting the urge to get in and confront them right there. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the desire to fully understand what was happening before taking any action. That night, Ethan returned home before Clara. He was sitting on the couch when she walked in, acting like nothing had happened. Ethan watched her carefully, trying to decipher every movement, every expression. Clara looked uncomfortable, but tried hard to maintain the facade. He wanted to confront her right then and there, but he knew it wasn't the time yet. He needed her to admit it herself. Over the next few days, the tension between them became almost palpable. Ethan started asking indirect questions, trying to force her to contradict herself, while Clara avoided eye contact whenever he mentioned something related to work or his outings. The situation seemed unsustainable, like a rope stretched to its maximum, about to break. The final confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon. Clara was in the garden, watering the plants, when Ethan approached her with her cell phone in her hands. He held it out to her, the screen still open to messages with Liam. Clara remained motionless for a few seconds, her face losing all color. There was no more denying it. She tried to mumble something, but Ethan interrupted her, his voice low but filled with deep pain. There was no need for him to say anything else. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream could be. Ethan knew that was just the tip of the iceberg. What Clara had done was not just a betrayal, it was the shattering of everything they had built together. But he also knew there was more to be revealed, something Clara still kept to herself, a secret she seemed willing to take to the grave. And as they stared at each other, each trying to process the weight of that moment, it became clear that this was just the beginning of what was to come. Ethan was sitting at the dining room table, his elbows resting on the polished wooden top, his intertwined fingers holding his forehead as he stared into space. The house was silent, the kind of silence that screamed louder than any sound. Clara was upstairs, locked in the room they shared before. Since the revelation of the betrayal, every moment has felt filled with unbearable tension, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. The weight was unbearable, but Ethan knew he needed answers. Her cell phone, now in her possession, had revealed more than just the kind words exchanged with Liam. Among the messages, a series of attached files caught his attention. Photographs, screenshots of old conversations, emails. He didn't have the courage to open them all right away, but he knew that the contents didn't promise anything good. This wasn't just an emotional or physical betrayal. There was something deeper, something that Clara had been hiding with meticulous care. He felt the weight of this secret crushing him, even though he didn't know exactly what it was. When Clara finally came down the stairs, her face was marked by tension and tiredness. There was a shadow in her eyes that Ethan had never seen before, something that wasn't just guilt but also fear. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, hesitating before taking another step. Ethan slowly lifted his head, locking his eyes with hers. The moment seemed to drag on, charged with an electricity that made every second seem like an eternity. He broke the silence first, his voice low but filled with a cold determination that made Clara shiver. "I won't ask again, Clara. I want the whole truth now. Not just about Liam. I want to know what else you're hiding. Because there is something more, isn't there? There's no point in lying, because I'm going to find out anyway. So it better come from you." Clara looked away, her face contorting in a mixture of anger, shame and despair. She knew that moment had arrived, the moment she feared so much and tried to escape. He sat in a chair opposite Ethan, his eyes fixed on his shaking hands, unable to look at him directly. "I don't know where to start," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Start at the beginning. Don't hide anything." "I deserve it," Ethan replied, frustration evident in his voice. Clara took a deep breath, struggling to organize her thoughts. Her mind was in chaos, but she knew there was no way out. "Ethan, this didn't start out as something I planned. I was lost, confused. And Liam. He just showed up at the right time, or maybe the wrong time. I don't know anymore. But that's not all. There's something bigger, something I haven't had the courage to tell you for years. Something that could change everything." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He was already expecting a difficult confession, but the implication that there was something bigger made him even more alert. "Keep going, Clara. Don't stop now." Clara squirmed in her seat, the words struggling to come out. "Ethan, remember the time when you were traveling a lot because of that big project on the coast? It was at that time that I became close to someone else. No, Liam. Someone else. I don't know how to tell you this in a way that doesn't hurt you, but there was a case. And, from this, something was born that I didn't have the courage to tell you." Ethan felt his stomach drop. He knew what he was about to hear, but still, nothing prepared him for the impact. He leaned forward, hands clenched into fists on the table. "What are you talking about, Clara? Be clear." She finally looked up, her eyes shining with tears that threatened to fall. "Ethan, there's a child. He is my son. And it's not yours." Her words pierced the air like knives. Ethan went still, as if his body had refused to register what he had just heard. A son? She had a son and never told him. He could barely process the implications. How is this possible? And where is he? Why didn't you ever tell me?" he demanded, voice cracking with the mix of disbelief and anger. Clara began to cry silently, the tears falling as she tried to find the words. "He is with his father's family. I didn't know how to deal with it at the time. I was afraid. Fear of destroying everything we built, fear of losing you. I didn't have the courage to tell you, so I kept it from us. But now there's no more hiding." Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth as he tried to contain the outburst of emotions. "Did you keep it from us? Do you think you can just hide something like that? How old, Clara? How many years have you lied to me every day? How many years did you pretend our life was real while hiding a child from me?" Clara couldn't answer. Every word from Ethan was like a blow, but she knew she deserved it. He knew there wasn't enough of an excuse for what he had done. Finally, she managed to whisper. "He's 9 years old, Ethan. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry about all of this. Ethan stopped, turning to face her. 9 years. 9 years of lies. He tried to process it, but the enormity of the revelation was overwhelming. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, voice thick with exhaustion. "Because I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. Not after all. You had to know. Even if it destroys us, you had to know," Clara replied, finally looking at Ethan with a pleading look. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan looked at Clara, trying to find something familiar about her, something that could justify all of this. But all he saw was a stranger, someone he barely recognized. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "I need time. I need to think. And you need to understand that there is no going back after this." Clara nodded, knowing that her actions had finally reached the point of no return. And as Ethan walked away, out the front door, she stood there, alone in the room, feeling the weight of her choices bearing down on her like an avalanche. Ethan drove aimlessly for hours, the silence inside the car echoing the chaos in his mind. Clara's confession resonated like an open wound, throbbing and impossible to ignore. Every word seemed to reverberate in his head. 9 years. A son. He tried to understand how someone could hide something like this for so long, how Clara had managed to share an entire life with him while keeping such a devastating secret. He felt betrayed in ways he didn't even know were possible. He parked in a deserted park, the dim light from the streetlights reflecting in the puddles left by a recent rain. The air was cold, but he barely noticed. He got out of the car and sat on a bench, with his hands buried in his face, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no point. Just a crushing emptiness, as if the entire ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He knew he had to make a decision, but how can he decide something when his entire life seemed like a lie? Meanwhile, Clara was in the room, motionless. The clock ticked the passage of time, but to her, every second seemed like an eternity. The confession had been like a terrible relief. For years she had carried the weight of that secret, convincing herself that she was protecting Ethan, protecting their marriage, but now she saw clearly that it had all been an illusion. She knew Ethan needed space, but the silence in the house was unbearable. She felt like a prisoner of her own mistakes, each memory eating away at any trace of hope. When the door finally opened, the sound made Clara startle. Ethan walked in, his shoulders tense, his face tired. He looked like he had aged years in just a few hours. Clara stood up, as if she wanted to say something, but Ethan raised his hand, interrupting her. He wasn't ready to hear excuses, and she knew it. He sat on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees, and was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "I need to understand. I need you to explain everything to me, Clara. Every detail. How did this happen? Why did you make these decisions? And why did you think it was acceptable to keep this from me for so long? I don't know if I want to forgive you, but before I do, I need answers." Clara felt a lump in her throat, but she knew there was no way to avoid it. He sat in the opposite armchair, hands clasped in his lap. "His father. He was someone I met when you were traveling. It was a weakness, Ethan, a choice I should never have made. But when I found out I was pregnant, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't face you, or what that would mean for us. So, I decided to keep it away. His family agreed to take care of the baby, and I accepted. I thought I was doing what was best for everyone." "The best for everyone?" Ethan interrupted, his voice thick with disbelief. "You decided what was best for me without even giving me the chance to know. You hid an entire part of your life, a part that you knew would destroy me. And worst of all, you continued living with me as if nothing had happened." "I knew that if I told the truth, I would lose you," Clara replied, her voice breaking. "And at the same time, I knew that hiding it was wrong. I lived with this guilt every day, Ethan. There hasn't been a moment where I haven't hated myself for it. And this is to make me feel better." Because it's not working, he replied, his tone bitter. He stood and began pacing the room, as if the movement would help him process. Where is he now? Your son. Where is it? Clara took a deep breath, knowing that this was the question she most feared answering. He is with his paternal grandparents. They take care of him, and I visit him from time to time. But I never introduced him to you. Ethan stopped, turning to face her. You visit him. You're still in contact with him, while I had no idea he even existed. This is surreal, Clara. Do you realize how absurd this sounds? Clara had no answer. Every word from Ethan was a blow she knew she deserved. I need to see him, Ethan declared, his voice firm. I need to look at him, understand who he is. Because, somehow, he is now part of my life, whether I want him to or not. Clara hesitated. I don't know if it's a good idea right now. He doesn't know anything about you, and I. And you kept him away from me, Ethan interrupted, his tone sharp. You don't have the right to decide that anymore, Clara. I'll see him. And I will decide what that means for me. The next day, Ethan insisted that Clara take him to the boy's grandparents' house. The journey was made in silence, each kilometer filled with tension. When they arrived, Clara hesitated before knocking on the door, but Ethan was determined. An older man opened it, and his expression changed when he saw Clara. They exchanged quick words before he invited Ethan inside. In the corner of the room, a boy was playing with building blocks. He had light brown hair, expressive eyes and a shy smile. Ethan felt the air escape his lungs. He didn't need confirmations. The similarity was undeniable. It was like looking at a younger version of Clara mixed with someone he didn't know. He felt an overwhelming mix of anger, sadness, and a strange kind of affection he didn't know could exist. The boy looked up, noticing Ethan. Who is he? He asked, his voice curious and innocent. Clara hesitated, but Ethan took the lead. I'm someone who wants to get to know you, he said, trying to control the emotion in his voice. As the boy smiled, Ethan felt something snap inside him. He knew that moment would change everything, but he had no idea how to move forward from there. All he knew was that nothing would ever be the same. Ethan left the boy's grandparents' house with his head racing with thoughts. Every detail of that encounter seemed engraved in his memory, like a movie that he knew would be impossible to forget. The boy, so full of life and innocence, had no idea of the complexity of what was happening around him. He was just a child, oblivious to the layers of lies, hasty decisions, and secrets that had shaped his existence. For Ethan, that was the hardest part to accept. The boy was not at fault. She was a victim, just like him, of Clara's tangle of choices. In the car, the silence between the two was almost unbearable. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the road, avoiding any attempt to look at Ethan. She knew that every word she said now could be taken in the worst possible way, and part of her felt like there was nothing more she could say to repair the damage. He, on the other hand, was lost in a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't know if he felt anger, sadness or something deeper that he couldn't name. The silence was like a barrier between them, a confirmation of the gulf that now existed in their marriage. Back at the house, Ethan went straight up to his room, closing the door behind him. Clara remained in the room, motionless, as if the weight of that moment had paralyzed her. She knew Ethan needed space, but she also knew he was struggling with issues that no amount of space could resolve. She desperately wanted to believe there was a way to salvage what was left of their relationship, but the reality was cruelly clear. The damage was done, and perhaps it was irreversible. Ethan stayed up all night, scrolling through memories of his wedding. He wondered at what moment everything started to go wrong, when the foundations of their relationship became fragile to the point of crumbling. He remembered how he and Clara used to talk for hours, laugh together, share dreams. That woman, who had once been his confidant, now seemed like a stranger. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional, almost spiritual. He wondered if it was possible to trust someone again who had hidden so much. The next morning, Clara tried to start a conversation. She knew she needed to face the consequences of her actions, but the uncertainty in Ethan's eyes made her hesitate. Finally, she found the courage to speak. "I know I can't undo what I did. And I also know that nothing I say now will change how you're feeling. But, Ethan, I need you to know that, despite everything, I never stopped loving you." Ethan looked at her, his face marked by the tiredness of a sleepless night. "Love is not enough, Clara. Not when it is accompanied by secrets and lies. You made decisions that affected my life without even giving me the chance to participate. And now I wonder if I'm capable of moving on from this." Clara felt the impact of his words like a punch to the stomach. But she knew he was right. There was no justification for what she did, and any attempt at an apology would ring hollow. She decided to remain silent, allowing Ethan to continue to process everything at his own pace. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Ethan avoided Clara whenever he could, spending more time outside the house while she remained there, lost in her own thoughts. He began to consider the possibility of divorce, something he never imagined he would have to face. But at the same time, there was the boy. He couldn't get it out of his head. The connection he felt in the brief encounter was unexpected but profound. He knew he couldn't just ignore that child's existence. This meant that somehow he and Clara would need to find a way to deal with this together, even if their marriage didn't survive. A moral dilemma began to consume Ethan. He could try to rebuild the relationship with Clara, but the trust was destroyed. He could walk away completely, but that would mean abandoning an innocent child who was now part of his life whether he wanted it or not. Each scenario seemed fraught with sacrifices, and he didn't know if he was strong enough to face any of them. Clara, in turn, began to reflect on her own failures. She knew her actions had been selfish, driven more by fear than anything else. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to face the depth of the damage she had caused, not only to Ethan, but also to the boy, who grew up without knowing the truth about his origins. She knew that no matter what happened between her and Ethan, she needed to be honest with herself and the people around her. When Ethan finally decided to confront her again, he was calmer but still charged with emotion. "We need to resolve this, Clara. Not just for the two of us, but for the boy. He deserves more than lies and secrets. I don't know if our marriage is salvageable, but it can't go on like this." Clara nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. "I agree, Ethan. He deserves the truth. And I will do whatever it takes to make this right, even if it means giving up everything." As the two began discussing next steps, it became clear that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. Ethan still didn't know what their future would be as a couple, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't allow that boy to be harmed by the choices Clara had made. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that, perhaps, there was a way to rebuild something from the ruins. The days that followed were a mix of difficult decisions and inevitable changes. Ethan was determined to take control of his life again, but he knew that meant facing situations he never imagined. The weight of the revelation still hung over him, but the anger he had initially felt was beginning to give way to quiet determination. He could not change the past, but he could ensure that the future was built with truth. Clara, on the other hand, seemed like a specter of the person she once was. The unwavering confidence and radiance that used to define her presence was gone, replaced by a fragility she could barely hide. She knew she was at her limit. Ethan was still there, but the line connecting him to her was tenuous and could break at any moment. For the first time, she began to understand the depth of the consequences of her choices, something she had previously avoided confronting. Ethan set up a meeting with the boy's grandparents, making it clear that he needed to establish a stronger connection with the child. Clara agreed to accompany him, even though she knew that each encounter would be a cruel reminder of her failures. The day of the visit arrived, and as they entered the house, the boy ran into the living room with the same innocent energy that Ethan remembered. But this time, something changed. He was no longer just an outside observer. He was determined to be a present and significant figure in that child's life. The conversation with the grandparents was long and full of emotional nuances. They were understandably reluctant, but Ethan made it clear that his intention was not to destabilize the boy's life. He wanted to build something new, a relationship that would be beneficial for everyone. In the end, an agreement was reached. Ethan would have the chance to spend more time with the boy, get to know him, understand who he was. Clara remained silent for most of the conversation, but her eyes betrayed the guilt she felt. She knew this was Ethan's chance to start healing the wounds she had caused, but she also knew it meant slowly moving away from everything. Time passed, and Ethan began to create genuine bonds with the boy. With each visit, he discovered something new, a laugh, a curiosity, a personality trait that seemed so familiar and yet so unique. Their relationship began to blossom, but with that came another realization for Ethan: his life with Clara had become unsustainable. He realized there was no going back to what they had before, not after everything that had happened. And finally, he made the decision to end the marriage. The day he told Clara was marked by an unsettling calm. They were sitting in the living room, and Ethan began to speak with a clarity that left Clara speechless. "I tried, Clara. I tried to find a way where we could rebuild something. But I realized that what we had no longer exists. We can't go back. I forgive you, but forgiving doesn't mean we can continue. I need to move on, and so do you." Clara felt a pain that seemed to rip something out of her. She knew this moment would come, but hearing it out loud felt like a final blow. She didn't try to argue, didn't beg. She just nodded, tears falling silently as she processed the end of everything she knew. Ethan watched her, and for a brief moment he felt a remnant of the love they once shared. But he knew that, for both of them, it was best to go their separate ways. The divorce was finalized amicably. Ethan focused on rebuilding his life, dedicating himself to his work and, above all, his relationship with the boy. He found a peace he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that came from the unexpected. Over time, he also began to open his heart again. He met someone, a woman who understood his scars but didn't hold them against him. Someone with whom he could build something new, without the ghosts of the past. Clara, in turn, decided she needed a fresh start. He moved to another city, far from everything that reminded him of his mistakes. She began working as a volunteer on projects that helped families in difficult situations, trying to find a way of redemption. Despite everything, she continued to visit the boy, trying to build a more authentic relationship with him, something she knew she owed to him and to herself. The boy grew up surrounded by love, with Ethan being a constant figure in his life. He never fully knew the events that surrounded him, but that didn't matter. He had a present father and a mother who, despite her mistakes, fought to be better. The story that began with lies and betrayal found a kind of balance, an acceptance of the past and a determination to build a better future. And just like that, the cycle of pain was ended. Each of those involved found a path, not without difficulties, but with the certainty that, despite everything, they had learned something about themselves. Ethan, Clara, and the boy moved on, each carrying the marks of what happened, but also the strength to start again. If you've made it this far, we want to know your opinion on the story. What did you think of this journey full of emotions and twists? Leave your comment below and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, here we reject any form of betrayal. These stories are fictional and serve to show how wrong decisions can profoundly impact the lives involved. Until next time.